In a glass tower boardroom, executives waited as a grocery store cashier walked in holding his final secret. Every morning before sunrise, a young black girl stopped at the same bus stop and handed breakfast to a quiet old man everyone else ignored. She thought she was simply helping someone who had nothing. But the day officers knocked on her door, she learned the truth. The homeless man she had been feeding was hiding a secret that would change her life and shock an entire city. The hallway outside apartment 4C smelled faintly of old paint and last night's fried food drifting up from the diner downstairs. A single yellow light buzzed overhead, flickering just enough to make the cracked walls look tired. It was 6:02 in the morning. In Southside Chicago, that meant the city was just beginning to stir. A distant bus groaned to a stop on the corner. Somewhere down the street, a delivery truck clanged metal doors shut. The sky outside was still gray, not quite morning, not quite night. Inside the small apartment, Tasha Williams was tying the laces of her worn sneakers. Her kitchen and living space were the same room, barely bigger than a hospital waiting room. A narrow counter held a cheap toaster, a jar of peanut butter, and a half loaf of white bread folded inside a plastic bag. The refrigerator hummed softly beside the sink, its door covered with overdue bills held up by a single magnet shaped like a sunflower. Tasha stood in front of the counter, finishing the last of 2 sandwiches. One she wrapped in wax paper and slid into a brown paper bag. The other she tucked into the pocket of her canvas work tote. 2 sandwiches. Every morning. Outside, the wind rattled the loose window frame. She glanced at the microwave clock. 6:04. If she missed the 6:20 bus, she'd be late for the breakfast shift at St. Vincent's Hospital cafeteria, and Mr. Alvarez, the kitchen manager, had already warned her twice this month. Tasha grabbed her thermos from the counter and filled it with black coffee. The smell rose warm and sharp in the small room. For a moment she paused, staring at the second paper bag sitting on the counter. Inside it were 3 things: a peanut butter sandwich, a banana, and the thermos she'd just filled. Breakfast for Harold, she smiled faintly, the kind of quiet smile that came from routine more than happiness. Then, knock. The sound was sharp, hard, not the casual knock of a neighbor, not the hesitant tap of the landlord. 3 solid knocks. Knock, knock, knock. Tasha froze. Nobody knocked on her door at 6 in the morning. She waited. The hallway outside went silent again. For a second, she wondered if she'd imagined it. Then, knock, knock, knock. This time louder, more deliberate. Her stomach tightened. Slowly, she set the thermos down. She wiped her hands on the sides of her jeans and stepped toward the door. The floor creaked softly beneath her feet. Another pause, then a voice from the hallway. "Miss Williams?" The voice was calm, professional, not angry, but not friendly either. Tasha felt a ripple of unease move through her chest. She reached the door and placed her hand on the knob. For a moment she hesitated. Then she opened it. The hallway light spilled across 3 figures standing directly outside her apartment. They were dressed in formal military uniforms, dark jackets, brass buttons polished bright, medals catching the dim light. 2 younger officers stood slightly behind the man in front. And the man in front, tall, broad-shouldered, gray hair trimmed short, stood perfectly straight, hands clasped behind his back. A colonel. Tasha blinked, unsure she was really seeing what she thought she was seeing. The colonel met her eyes. His expression wasn't cold, but it was serious, measured. "Miss Tasha Williams?" Her throat felt suddenly dry. "Yes." For a second, nobody spoke. The hallway seemed to shrink around them, the buzzing ceiling light the only sound. Then the colonel nodded once. "Ma'am," he said, his voice steady. "I'm Colonel Daniel Hayes." He gestured briefly toward the 2 officers beside him. "This is Lieutenant Martinez and Officer Carter." The names barely registered in Tasha's mind. Her heart had already started beating faster. Military officers did not come to her building. Military officers did not knock on her door. And they definitely did not come looking for someone like her. Colonel Hayes shifted slightly, his gaze calm but intent. "We apologize for arriving this early," he said, "but we need to speak with you." Tasha felt the unease in her chest tighten. "About what?" The colonel held her gaze. "About a man named Harold Bennett." The name hit her like a sudden drop in temperature. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the door. Harold. For a moment she couldn't speak. The old man at the bus stop, the one she brought breakfast to every morning, the one who slept on flattened cardboard outside the laundromat, the one everyone else walked past like he wasn't even there. Her mind jumped immediately to the worst possibility. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. Did something happen to him? The colonel's expression softened just slightly. Not pity, but something close. That's what we're here to talk about. Behind him, the two younger officers remained silent, their posture stiff and formal. Tasha glanced past them down the long hallway. A neighbor's door creaked open a few inches. Someone inside was watching. She turned back to the colonel. Her heart was racing now. I don't understand. Colonel Hayes studied her face for a moment. Then he spoke again, more carefully this time. "Miss Williams, we've been trying to locate you for several days." "Locate me?" "Yes." Her confusion only deepened. "I don't know anything about the military," she said quickly. "I work at a hospital cafeteria." The colonel gave a small nod. "We're aware of that." Tasha felt the world tilt slightly. "You are?" "Yes, ma'am." He paused. Then he said the sentence that made the hallway feel suddenly colder. "We're here because of what you did for Harold Bennett." Her mind struggled to keep up. "What I did?" "You brought him breakfast," Colonel Hayes said. "Every morning." Tasha stared at him. "How do you know that?" For the first time, the colonel hesitated. Just a fraction of a second. Then he answered, "Because Mr. Bennett told us." The words hung in the air. Tasha's heart skipped. Told them? Harold barely talked to anyone. Most days people pretended he didn't exist. How would he? She stopped. Another possibility pushed into her mind. Her voice dropped to a whisper. Is he in trouble? Colonel Hayes shook his head slowly. No, ma'am. The answer should have relieved her, but somehow it didn't. Instead, the colonel straightened his shoulders slightly and said something that made her pulse pound even harder. Miss Williams, Harold Bennett wasn't who you thought he was. Tasha blinked. What do you mean? The colonel held her gaze for a long moment. Then he said quietly, He asked us to find you. The hallway went completely silent. Even the buzzing ceiling light seemed to fade. Tasha's heart thudded against her ribs. Why? Colonel Hayes didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced briefly down the corridor, then back at her. May we come in? He asked. Her apartment suddenly felt very small, but she stepped aside. The three officers entered carefully, their polished shoes soft against the worn floor. The room barely had space for them. The colonel looked around once, taking in the tiny kitchen, the single mattress in the corner, the stack of unpaid bills on the counter. His eyes lingered for a moment on the brown paper bag sitting beside the thermos, the breakfast she'd just packed. For Harold, he said quietly. Tasha nodded. I bring it to him every morning. The colonel looked back at her. His expression was different now. Respectful. Almost solemn. Miss Williams, he said, what you did for that man matters more than you know. Her heart tightened again. "Where is he?" The colonel drew a slow breath. Then he answered, "That's a long story." Tasha felt the room grow very still. "Then you better tell me," she said softly, because suddenly she needed to know what could possibly connect a homeless man at a bus stop to 3 military officers standing in her kitchen at dawn. And why did it feel like whatever they were about to say was about to change everything she thought she knew about Harold Bennett? Outside, the distant growl of a city bus echoed down the street, the same bus Tasha usually caught every morning. But this morning, she wasn't going anywhere. And somewhere deep inside her chest, a quiet voice whispered a question she wasn't ready to hear. Who was Harold Bennett, really? And why had he chosen her? The colonel opened the folder he carried. The story was about to begin. But before he could speak, Tasha's mind had already drifted somewhere else. Back to the bus stop. 6 months earlier, the wind had been bitter that morning, the kind of cold Chicago wind that slipped through coats and made the metal bus bench feel like ice. The sky was still dark when Tasha turned the corner of Clayton Street on her way to catch the number 47 bus. That was the first time she really noticed him. The old man was lying on flattened cardboard beside the bus shelter, wrapped in a faded army green blanket that had seen too many winters. His shoes were cracked. His gray beard was uneven, like he'd tried cutting it himself with dull scissors. Next to him sat a black trash bag tied at the top, the only thing that looked like it might hold everything he owned. People were already waiting for the bus. A woman in a long coat stood several feet away from him, staring down at her phone like the man didn't exist. A teenager leaned against the glass wall of the shelter with headphones on. A businessman paced near the curb, checking his watch. No one looked at the old man. They simply stepped around him. Tasha had done the same thing the first few mornings. She'd kept her head down, her backpack slung over one shoulder, telling herself she didn't have enough to help anyone. She barely had enough for herself. But that morning had been different. The cafeteria at St. Vincent's had been busy the day before, and one of the cooks had wrapped up a leftover egg sandwich for her to take home. She'd tucked it into her bag, thinking she'd eat it between classes later that night, except she never got the chance. Her grocery store shift ran late, and by the time she got home after midnight, she was too tired to think about food. Now the sandwich sat in her bag as she waited for the bus. She glanced down at the old man again. His eyes were open, clear, watching the street. Not begging, not reaching out, just watching. For a moment their eyes met. Tasha quickly looked away. She told herself it wasn't her responsibility. But the sandwich felt heavier in her bag with every passing second. Finally she sighed, stepped forward, and crouched beside him. "Excuse me," she said softly. The old man turned his head slowly. Up close, his face looked older than she'd thought. Deep lines around his mouth, skin weathered from too many days in the sun and wind. But his eyes were sharp, not confused, not distant. Sharp. Tasha reached into her bag and pulled out the wrapped sandwich. "I made too much," she said, holding it out. It was a small lie. "You want it?" For a moment he didn't move. His eyes shifted from the sandwich to her face. "You should keep that," he said quietly. His voice was calm, steady. "You probably need it more than I do." Tasha gave a small shrug. "Maybe," she said, "but I'm offering." Another long moment passed. Then he reached out. He took the sandwich with both hands like it was something fragile. "Thank you," he said. "Miss Tasha." He nodded once. "Thank you, Miss Tasha." His manners caught her off guard. She stood up quickly, brushing the cold from her knees. "That's okay," she said. Then she started walking toward the bus. But before she reached the curb, she heard him say something behind her. George used to say the same thing. She turned slightly. George? My brother, he said. He always said kindness was the one thing the world couldn't tax. Tasha smiled faintly. Well, she said, I guess your brother was right. The bus pulled up with a hiss of brakes. She climbed aboard and took a seat near the back. Through the window, she watched the old man unwrap the sandwich slowly. He didn't eat it right away. Instead, he looked down at it for a long time, like it was something valuable. That image stayed with her the rest of the day. The next morning, when Tasha stood in her tiny kitchen getting ready for work, she found herself making 2 sandwiches instead of 1. She wrapped the second one carefully, just in case. When she reached the bus stop, the old man was sitting upright on his cardboard. He noticed her right away. You're early, he said. You're always here, she replied. He chuckled softly. That's because rent's cheap. She held out the sandwich. And I brought coffee. His eyebrows lifted. Well now, he said, that's luxury. She poured the coffee from her thermos into the lid and handed it to him. Steam curled into the cold morning air. He took a sip and closed his eyes for a moment. Black coffee, he said. Perfect. What's your name? She asked. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. Harold, he said. Harold Bennett. She nodded. Nice to meet you. From that morning on, it became routine. Every day at 6:15. Tasha would walk down Clayton Street with a brown paper bag in her hand. Harold would already be awake. Sometimes they talked for 5 minutes, sometimes 10. Sometimes they just sat quietly while the city woke up around them. She learned little things about him. He liked black coffee. He hated oatmeal. And he had the strange habit of staring at helicopters whenever they passed overhead. One morning, while they sat on the cold bus bench, a helicopter flew across the pale winter sky. Harold followed it with his eyes. Used to fly one of those, he said. Tasha glanced up. You did? Long time ago. For the army? He smiled faintly. Something like that. She assumed he was exaggerating, or remembering things differently than they'd really happened. But she didn't challenge him. Because the truth was, the stories didn't matter. What mattered was the way he said thank you every morning. The way he always split the sandwich in half if he noticed she hadn't eaten. The way he never asked for anything. Weeks passed. Then months. And slowly, without either of them saying it out loud, the bus stop became something more than just a place to wait for the number 47. It became the one moment of the day where Tasha felt like the world made a little more sense. What she didn't know then, what she couldn't possibly know, was that the man sitting beside her on that cracked bus bench, the quiet old man everyone else walked past, had once been someone the entire country depended on, and that one day, very soon, the world would come looking for him. Right at that bus stop, and everything would change. But at the time, the mornings felt ordinary. Cold Chicago mornings came with the same sounds every day. Buses hissing to a stop, the hum of traffic building slowly, the distant rumble of the elevated train crossing steel tracks a few blocks away. And every morning at 6:15, Tasha Williams walked down Clayton Street carrying the same brown paper bag. The routine had become part of her life the way breathing had. She woke at 5, made 2 sandwiches, poured coffee into the thermos, then walked 3 blocks through the quiet streets toward the bus stop. Some mornings the sidewalks were empty. Other mornings early workers stood waiting beneath the flickering shelter light. Harold was always there, sometimes sitting upright on the cardboard, sometimes leaning against the brick wall beside the laundromat with his blanket pulled around his shoulders, but always awake, always waiting. When he saw Tasha approaching with the paper bag, his face softened in a quiet way that made the long lines around his eyes look less tired. You're right on time, he'd say. Bus waits for nobody, she'd reply. They'd share the sandwich and coffee while the sky slowly turned pale above the rooftops. At first, people ignored them. But over time, the looks started. The stares, the whispers. One morning in early April, the tension finally surfaced. Tasha had just handed Harold the thermos lid filled with coffee when a black Mercedes rolled to a stop beside the curb. The engine hummed smoothly before shutting off. The driver's door opened, and a man in a charcoal suit stepped out. He looked like the kind of man who lived downtown in a high-rise with floor-to-ceiling windows. Polished shoes, expensive coat, silver watch catching the early light. He walked toward the bus stop while adjusting the cuff of his sleeve. Then he noticed them. Tasha sitting beside Harold, the sandwich resting between them. The man slowed. His eyes moved over Harold first, then to Tasha, and the expression that crossed his face was something between amusement and irritation. "Well," he said under his breath, just loud enough to be heard, "guess charity starts early these days." Tasha kept her voice calm. "Good morning?" The man glanced down at Harold again. "You feeding him every day?" he asked. Tasha didn't answer right away. "Yes," she said finally. The man shook his head. "You know guys like this," he said. "They'll take whatever you give them and be right back here tomorrow." Harold stayed silent, staring quietly at the sidewalk. The businessman looked at Tasha again. "You're wasting your food." Tasha felt heat rise in her chest. "He's hungry," she said. "That's not the point." The man laughed lightly. "The point is, people like him don't change." The words hung in the cold morning air. Tasha stood slowly. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was steady. "People like him," she said carefully, "are still people." The businessman stared at her. For a moment it seemed like he might argue, but instead he shrugged. "Suit yourself?" He stepped onto the bus as it pulled up and disappeared inside. The doors closed. The bus drove away, leaving the bus stop quiet again. Tasha sat back down beside Harold. For a while neither of them spoke. Finally Harold chuckled softly. "That man drives a car worth more than this entire block." Tasha gave a small smile. "Still can't buy manners." Harold nodded slowly. "You've got a fighter's heart," he said. She looked at him. "What does that mean?" "It means," he said, staring down the empty street, "you stand up when it would be easier not to." She shrugged. "I just don't like bullies." Harold smiled faintly. "That'll serve you well in life." But not everyone reacted like the businessman. Later that week, a young mother waiting for the bus pulled her child closer when she saw Harold. "Don't go near that man," she whispered sharply. Tasha heard it. So did Harold. He kept his eyes down, pretending not to notice. But Tasha noticed, and it hurt more than she expected. The worst moment came a few days later. Rain had soaked the streets overnight, leaving the sidewalks slick and shining beneath the streetlights. Harold's blanket was damp, the cardboard beneath him sagging. Tasha had just arrived with breakfast when a man in a construction jacket walked past. Without slowing, the man kicked Harold's blanket with the toe of his boot. "Move your stuff," he muttered. The blanket slid halfway into a shallow puddle. Tasha jumped to her feet. "Hey!" The man didn't stop walking. "What's wrong with you?" she called after him. He waved dismissively over his shoulder. "Sidewalk ain't his living room." Tasha bent down and pulled the blanket back onto the cardboard. The fabric smelled faintly of rain and old wool. Harold's hands trembled slightly as he helped her wring water from the edge. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly. "Yes, I did." He looked up at her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Harold said something that surprised her. "You remind me of someone." "Who?" "My daughter." Tasha blinked. "You have a daughter?" He hesitated. Then he gave a small shake of his head. Had. The word hung there. Tasha didn't ask anything else. Instead, she handed him the sandwich. Eat before it gets cold. He took a bite, chewed slowly. Then he did something he often did when he thought she wasn't looking. He broke the sandwich in half and handed part of it back. Fair's fair, he said. Tasha hesitated. You need it more. Harold shrugged. You're working 2 jobs and going to school. How do you know that? You talk in your sleep, he said dryly. She laughed. I do not. He smiled faintly. Maybe not, but people reveal more than they realize. For a while they sat quietly together. Cars passed. The sky brightened. The city woke. And somewhere deep inside, something small but powerful had begun forming between them. Respect, trust, the kind that didn't need big words, what neither of them realized yet. Was that someone else had started noticing too? Not the businessman, not the mother at the bus stop. Someone far away, someone powerful, someone who would eventually hear about a homeless man named Harold Bennett and the young woman who brought him breakfast every single morning. And when that day came, the world would finally start paying attention. But first, things were about to get harder. Much harder. Because kindness, Harold knew better than anyone, always gets tested. That lesson arrived quietly in Tasha Williams's life, not in one dramatic moment, but in the slow pressure of ordinary days. The kind of days that wore a person down little by little. Her alarm rang at 5 o'clock every morning. Not a gentle chime, an old phone buzzing against the wooden nightstand she'd found on the curb 2 years ago. The room was still dark when she sat up. Her apartment never really warmed up in the winter months. Even in spring, the air inside carried a stubborn chill that crept through the thin walls and settled into the floorboards. Tasha swung her feet onto the cold floor and pulled a hoodie over her shoulders. The apartment was small enough that she could see everything without moving. The narrow mattress in the corner, the second-hand table beside the window, the tiny kitchen counter where a jar of peanut butter sat next to a loaf of white bread, and the refrigerator. Its door was covered with envelopes, electric bill, student loan notice, a reminder from the landlord written in thick black marker on a yellow sticky note, payment due. She walked over and opened the fridge. 3 eggs, half a carton of milk, a container of leftover rice from 2 nights ago, and a single banana. Tasha stared for a moment. Then she closed the door. She didn't need the eggs today. Instead, she set 2 slices of bread on the counter and began spreading peanut butter carefully across each one. The same routine she'd done every morning for months. 2 sandwiches, one for her, one for Harold. From the hallway outside, someone's television blared morning news through thin walls. Another neighbor slammed their door. The building was waking up. Tasha wrapped both sandwiches in wax paper and slid them into separate brown bags. She hesitated for a second before adding the banana to Harold's bag. Then she filled the thermos with coffee. The smell was strong and comforting, filling the room with warmth the heater never quite managed. She glanced again at the stack of envelopes on the refrigerator. The electric bill alone was overdue by almost 2 weeks. Her hours at the grocery store had been cut recently, and tuition for the community college nursing program was due next month. Some days the numbers felt impossible. That night, after finishing her shift at the grocery store, Tasha stopped by the laundromat across from the bus stop. The machines rattled loudly as they spun. She sat on a plastic chair, folding her uniform shirt, when a familiar voice spoke behind her. "You look tired, girl." It was Mrs. Carter. Mrs. Carter worked as the kitchen supervisor at St. Vincent's Hospital cafeteria. She was nearly 60, with silver streaks in her hair and sharp eyes that seemed to notice everything. She dropped into the chair beside Tasha with a grunt. "You eating enough?" she asked. Tasha smiled politely. I'm fine. Mrs. Carter gave her a look. I've worked in kitchens 30 years, she said. I know when someone's skipping meals. Tasha didn't answer. Mrs. Carter leaned closer. Still feeding that old man at the bus stop? Tasha paused. Yes. Mrs. Carter shook her head slowly. Baby, you're barely keeping your own lights on. I know. So why you doing it? Tasha folded the last shirt carefully. Because nobody else does. Mrs. Carter sighed. You got a soft heart? Maybe. Soft hearts get bruised. Tasha shrugged. Maybe. Mrs. Carter studied her for a moment longer. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a plastic food container. Leftover pasta from the cafeteria. She shoved it into Tasha's hands. Take it. I can't. You can. Mrs. Carter stood. And tomorrow you eat it. She pointed a finger at her. That's an order. Tasha laughed softly. Yes, ma'am. Later that night, Tasha lay on her mattress staring at the ceiling. The city outside never really slept. Sirens echoed in the distance. A car alarm chirped once and fell silent. She turned her head toward the small window beside the bed. From here, she could see the glow of the streetlight outside. And beyond that, the bus stop where Harold slept. She thought about the businessman who'd mocked them, the man who'd kicked Harold's blanket, the mother who pulled her child away. The world seemed to move faster every day, people rushing past one another, everyone looking down at their phones. No one stopping. Except her. She closed her eyes. Tomorrow morning she'd wake up again, make 2 sandwiches, walk down Clayton Street, and sit beside Harold while the city slowly woke up. Maybe it didn't change the world, but it changed something, at least for those 10 minutes every morning. The next day, the wind had picked up again. Loose trash swirled across the sidewalk as Tasha approached the bus stop. Harold was already awake, but something looked different. He was sitting straighter than usual, and when she handed him the sandwich, he didn't open it right away. Instead, he stared at the sky. A helicopter passed overhead, its blades chopping steadily through the cold morning air. Harold followed it with his eyes. For a moment, something in his expression changed. Not the tired look of a man who'd slept outside. Something sharper, focused, like a memory had suddenly come rushing back. You ever notice, he said quietly, how a helicopter leans slightly left when it banks? Tasha looked up. I guess I never paid attention. Harold nodded slowly. Most people don't. The helicopter disappeared behind the buildings. Harold looked down at his hands. Then he said something she didn't expect. I used to fly one of those. Tasha smiled gently. You told me. He didn't smile back. I wasn't joking. She studied his face. Something in his tone felt different this time. More serious. More certain. Before she could ask anything else, Harold reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a small envelope. The paper was worn, edges softened from being carried around too long. He held it out to her. If something happens to me, he said quietly, I need you to mail this. Tasha frowned. What do you mean? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he pressed the envelope into her hand. Just promise me. She turned it over. An address was written in careful handwriting, but she didn't read it yet. Instead, she looked back at Harold. You're not going anywhere, she said. He smiled faintly. That's not always our choice. Her chest tightened. Harold, he shook his head gently. Just promise. After a moment, she nodded. Okay. He seemed relieved. Good. She slipped the envelope into her bag. The bus roared around the corner, doors hissing open. Tasha stood. I'll see you tomorrow. Harold gave a small wave, but as the bus pulled away, and she looked back through the window. He was still sitting there, watching the helicopter disappear into the clouds. And for the first time since she'd met him, Tasha had the strange feeling that Harold Bennett wasn't simply an old man who told stories. He was someone who had lived a life far bigger than the sidewalk where he slept, a life the world had forgotten. But soon, the world would remember, and when it did, everything would change. But for now, the world kept moving the same way it always had. The bus still arrived at 6:20 each morning. The wind still rushed down Clayton Street between rows of aging brick buildings, and Harold Bennett still slept beside the bus shelter outside the closed laundromat. To everyone else, he was invisible. To Tasha Williams, he was part of the morning. That spring, the city slowly warmed. The snow melted into muddy gutters, and the gray skies lifted into a pale blue that lasted a few hours each afternoon. Tasha continued her routine. Wake up at 5. Make 2 sandwiches. Pour coffee. Walk 3 blocks. Sit beside Harold. Catch the bus. It was simple, predictable, and somehow comforting. One Tuesday morning, as they sat together sharing breakfast, Harold pointed toward the sky again. A helicopter drifted above the rooftops, sunlight flashing off its spinning blades. Bell UH-1, Harold said. Tasha blinked. What? The helicopter, he said. Huey model. She laughed softly. You can tell that just from looking? He nodded. Spent a lot of time in one. She tilted her head. You really did fly helicopters, didn't you? Harold shrugged. A long time ago. For the army? He hesitated, then smiled faintly. Something like that. Tasha had learned by now that Harold liked to tell stories. Some mornings it was about helicopters. Other mornings it was about deserts and mountains in places she'd never heard of. Once he described flying through thick fog while carrying people who couldn't afford to be captured. Another time he mentioned senators and diplomats like they were ordinary passengers. The first few times she heard these stories, she assumed he was exaggerating, or maybe remembering movies instead of real life. But there was something about the way he told them that made her pause. He didn't sound like someone trying to impress anyone. His voice was quiet, matter of fact, like he was remembering something rather than inventing it. Still, the stories were hard to believe. One morning she asked him directly, Harold, did you really do all that? He took a slow sip of coffee. Then he looked out at the street where cars rolled past. I've lived a long life, he said. That doesn't answer the question. He smiled. Some stories aren't meant to be believed. That was the closest thing to an answer she ever got. Weeks passed. The envelope Harold had given her stayed in the bottom of her bag. Tasha had tried not to think about it, but sometimes she wondered what was inside. One afternoon after work, curiosity almost got the better of her. She sat on her mattress with the envelope in her hands. The paper felt heavier than it should. An address was written neatly across the front. She squinted at it. But instead of opening it, she placed it back in her bag. A promise was a promise. The next morning at the bus stop, Harold seemed quieter than usual. The wind rattled a loose metal sign above the shelter. Tasha handed him the sandwich. You okay? She asked. He nodded slowly. Just thinking. About what? About how strange life is. She laughed. That's a pretty big topic for 6:15 in the morning. He chuckled. Fair point. Then he did something unusual. He studied her carefully. You ever wonder how small decisions change everything? Like what? Like deciding to help someone. Tasha shrugged. I didn't really think about it. But you did it anyway. Yeah. Harold nodded. You could have walked past me like everyone else. That didn't feel right. He smiled softly. That's exactly my point. The bus roared toward the stop, its headlights glowing in the early morning light. Tasha stood up. "See you tomorrow, Harold." He lifted his hand. Tomorrow. But that tomorrow didn't come the way either of them expected. The following Monday morning, the bus stop was empty. No cardboard, no blanket, no Harold. Tasha slowed her steps. She scanned the sidewalk. Maybe he had moved to the other side of the shelter. Maybe he'd gone to the convenience store down the street. But the place where he usually slept was bare. She waited. 5 minutes. 10 minutes. The bus arrived. Passengers stepped on. Still no Harold. Tasha hesitated before boarding. A strange unease settled in her chest. All day at work, she kept glancing at the clock. When her shift ended, she walked back to the bus stop. Still empty. The cardboard was gone. The trash bag that held Harold's belongings was gone. Even the faint outline where he usually slept had disappeared. She stood there for a long moment, watching cars pass beneath the streetlights. A cold feeling crept into her stomach. Where had he gone? Had someone forced him to move? Had the police cleared the sidewalk? Or had something worse happened? The next morning, she brought breakfast anyway. She stood at the bus stop holding the paper bag, waiting. People stared at her like she was the strange one now. But Harold never appeared. By Wednesday, worry had settled deep in her chest. She stopped by the Mercy Street shelter after work. The intake desk clerk barely looked up. "You got a name?" the woman asked. "Harold Bennett." The clerk typed slowly, then shook her head. "Not here." "What about hospitals?" "Can't give that information." Tasha walked back into the night, feeling helpless. For the first time in months, she didn't know where Harold was, or if he was safe. On the 7th day, she returned to the bus stop one more time. She placed the paper bag down beside the brick wall where he usually slept. Inside it were the usual things: a sandwich, a banana, and a note written on a scrap of notebook paper. "Hope you're okay. Tasha." She stood there for a moment longer. The wind tugged at her jacket. Then she turned and walked away. But as she reached the corner, something made her glance back, and that's when she saw him. Harold, sitting on the cardboard again. Thinner, paler, but alive. Relief rushed through her chest so suddenly it made her dizzy. She ran back toward him. "Harold!" He looked up slowly. For a moment his eyes seemed unfocused. Then recognition returned. "Miss Tasha," he said quietly. She crouched beside him. "Where were you?" He tried to smile. "Had a spell?" "A spell? Just needed a few days." She studied his face. Something wasn't right. His skin looked pale, and there was a thin scar across the back of his hand she'd never seen before. "What happened?" she asked. He pulled his sleeve down quickly. "Nothing. Harold, I'm all right." His voice was gentle but firm. She sighed. "You scared me." He nodded. "I'm sorry." She handed him the sandwich from the paper bag she'd left earlier. "You missed a lot of breakfasts." He chuckled weakly. "I figured you'd come back." She looked at him. "How did you know?" Harold opened the sandwich slowly. "Because people like you don't quit on people like me." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Harold looked at her again. His eyes were serious now. "Tasha." "Yes?" "If anything ever happens to me," she frowned. "You already said that. Promise me you'll send the letter." She hesitated. "Okay." He nodded once, satisfied. The bus pulled into the stop with a hiss. Tasha stood up. "See you tomorrow." Harold raised his hand in a small wave. But as the bus pulled away, and she looked back through the window. He was watching her leave, with the quiet expression of someone who knew something she didn't. And deep down, Harold Bennett had a feeling their time was running out. The morning air carried the sharp smell of rain. Clouds hung low over Clayton Street, turning the early sunlight into a dull gray glow. Puddles from the night before reflected the traffic lights and the passing buses. Tasha walked toward the bus stop with her usual paper bag in hand. But something felt different. The street was quieter than normal. The old laundromat across the road had a sign taped to the door, "Closed for repairs." When she reached the shelter, Harold was already awake. He wasn't sitting the way he normally did. Instead, he stood leaning against the brick wall, arms folded across his chest, watching the street like a man waiting for someone. "You're up early," Tasha said. Harold turned. A small smile appeared, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Didn't sleep much." She handed him the bag. He didn't open it immediately. Instead, he kept looking down the street. "You waiting for someone?" she asked. "Maybe." That answer made her pause. Harold had never mentioned expecting visitors before. He usually talked about the past, not the future. Tasha sat beside him on the bench. "You okay?" she asked quietly. Harold nodded. "Just thinking again." "That's your favorite activity." He chuckled softly, but after a moment he spoke again. "Tasha, do you remember the first day we met?" "Of course." "You didn't have to stop." "I know." "But you did." She shrugged. "People should help each other." Harold looked at her for a long moment. "You'd be surprised how rare that is." The wind rattled the bus stop sign again. A car drove past slowly, its tires hissing through water on the road. Then Harold said something unusual. "Do you believe people can disappear?" Tasha frowned. "Disappear?" "Yes." "Like move away?" "No." His voice was quieter now. "Like the world just forgets them." She didn't answer right away. Finally, she said, "I guess that happens." Harold nodded slowly. "It happens more often than people realize." The bus engine could be heard in the distance, but Harold wasn't watching the road anymore. He was watching something behind her. Tasha turned slightly. Across the street, a black sedan had pulled to the curb. It was sleek and clean, the kind of car that looked out of place on Clayton Street. The engine idled quietly. The windows were tinted dark. Tasha felt a strange ripple of unease. "You know them?" she asked. Harold's expression didn't change. "No," but he kept watching the car. A minute passed. Then the sedan pulled away slowly and turned the corner. The tension in Harold's shoulders relaxed just a little. "Friend of yours?" Tasha asked again. "Not exactly." "That didn't look like someone lost." Harold sighed. "No." The bus rounded the corner. Tasha stood. "You're being mysterious this morning." He smiled faintly. "Old habits. From flying helicopters? From surviving." The doors of the bus opened. But before she stepped inside, Harold spoke again. "Tasha." She turned. "If something happens to me, don't be scared." Her stomach tightened. "I don't like the way that sounds. I just want you to remember something." "What?" He looked directly at her. "You did something good." She frowned. "That's not the point." "It is." The bus driver cleared his throat impatiently. "Coming or not?" Tasha stepped onto the bus, but as she found a seat and the bus pulled away, she kept thinking about the black sedan and about the way Harold had watched it. That evening, rain fell hard over the city. The grocery store where Tasha worked smelled like wet coats and damp pavement as customers hurried in and out. Near closing time, Mrs. Carter appeared again. She leaned against the checkout counter. You look distracted. Tasha scanned a carton of milk. Just tired. Mrs. Carter wasn't convinced. What's wrong? Tasha hesitated. Then she said quietly, You ever get the feeling something's about to happen? Mrs. Carter raised an eyebrow. Like what? I don't know. She described the black sedan, the way Harold had reacted, the strange things he'd said. Mrs. Carter listened silently. When Tasha finished, the older woman crossed her arms. That man you've been feeding, you really know him? Not really. And he's been talking about helicopters, politicians, disappearing people. Tasha nodded slowly. Mrs. Carter looked thoughtful. You ever consider he might not be crazy? Tasha blinked. What do you mean? I mean, maybe those stories are real. Tasha laughed nervously. That sounds even crazier. Maybe. Mrs. Carter shrugged. But sometimes the people everyone ignores turn out to be the ones with the biggest stories. The store lights flickered once. Closing time. As Tasha locked the front doors, rain hammered the windows harder. The street outside was nearly empty. That night she lay awake longer than usual. The envelope Harold had given her sat on the small table beside the bed. She picked it up again, turned it over in her hands. The paper felt heavier now, important somehow. She almost opened it again. Almost. But she placed it back down. Outside, thunder rolled across the sky. Morning came with fog hanging low over the city. Tasha hurried toward the bus stop. Something felt wrong even before she reached the corner. The cardboard was still there. The blanket, too. But Harold wasn't moving. He was sitting exactly where she'd left him the day before. Head tilted slightly forward, hands resting on his knees. Too still. Tasha's heart skipped. Harold? No answer. She stepped closer. Harold? Still nothing. The city rushed around them, cars, buses, footsteps. But in that small space beside the brick wall, everything felt suddenly quiet. Too quiet. Tasha reached out and touched his shoulder. His body shifted slightly, but he didn't respond. Her breath caught. Harold? A passerby slowed down. Is he okay? I don't know. The man stepped closer. Then he shook his head gently. You should call someone. Tasha's hands trembled as she pulled out her phone. Within minutes, the wail of sirens echoed down Clayton Street. An ambulance. 2 paramedics stepped out quickly. They checked Harold's pulse, listened for breathing. Then one of them looked up. The expression on his face said everything. I'm sorry, he said quietly. Tasha stared at him. The words felt unreal, impossible. Harold Bennett, the quiet old man who told impossible stories, was gone. Rain began to fall again, light at first. A police officer approached with a clipboard. Did you know him? He asked. Tasha nodded slowly. His name is Harold Bennett. The officer wrote it down. Any family? She hesitated. Then she remembered the envelope, the one sitting on the table in her apartment. I might know someone who does. The officer nodded. All right. We'll need to file a report. As they lifted Harold onto the stretcher, the rain began falling harder. People walked past without stopping. The city continued moving, just like it always did. But for Tasha, everything had suddenly changed. Because now the promise she'd made to Harold was no longer just a promise. It was something she had to finish, and she had no idea. That mailing that letter would soon uncover a secret that would shake the entire city. Rain continued falling long after the ambulance had gone. By the time Tasha reached her apartment that evening, the sky had turned the deep blue of early night, and the streets glistened beneath the glow of streetlights. She climbed the narrow staircase to her unit slowly. Every step felt heavier than usual. The hallway smelled faintly of old paint and damp carpet. Inside her apartment, everything looked exactly the same. The small table by the window, the refrigerator covered in overdue bills, the quiet hum of the old heater struggling to keep the room warm. But something felt different. For months, her mornings had started with Harold Bennett. Now the bus stop felt empty just thinking about it. Tasha set her bag on the table and sat down. For a long time, she simply stared at the wall. Her mind replayed the moment over and over. Harold sitting still on the bench. The paramedic's quiet voice. "I'm sorry." The sound of rain tapping the window pulled her back. Then she remembered. The letter. Her eyes moved slowly toward her bag. The promise. Tasha reached inside and pulled out the worn envelope Harold had given her weeks earlier. The paper was creased from being carried around so long. She held it carefully, turning it in her hands. The address written on the front caught the light from the lamp. It was neat, precise, almost military in its handwriting. She read it slowly. Bennett and Cole Aviation Holdings, 12th floor, Westbridge Tower, downtown. Tasha frowned. Aviation Holdings? The word sounded strange next to the image she had of Harold sitting on cardboard beside the bus stop. She turned the envelope over, still sealed. She thought about opening it, just to see what was inside. But Harold's voice echoed in her mind. "If something happens to me, I need you to mail this." He had trusted her. So instead of opening it, she grabbed her jacket. The nearest mailbox stood 2 blocks away. The rain had slowed to a drizzle by the time she stepped outside. Cars passed quietly along the wet street. Water dripped from the edges of fire escapes above. Tasha walked quickly. When she reached the blue mailbox on the corner, she stopped. The envelope felt heavier than before, almost like it carried more than paper. She hesitated for just a second. Then he slid it through the metal slot. The sound it made, soft, final, echoed in the quiet street. And just like that, her promise was fulfilled. Or so she thought. The next 3 days passed quietly, too quietly. Without Harold, Tasha's routine felt empty. She still woke at 5, still made 2 sandwiches out of habit. But now the second one sat untouched in the fridge. At the bus stop, people came and went like always. But no one occupied the small space beside the brick wall anymore. By Friday afternoon, life began to settle back into its normal rhythm. Tasha worked her shift at the grocery store, scanned items, smiled politely, listened to the same music playing softly over the store speakers. At closing time, Mrs. Carter appeared beside her again. "You all right?" Tasha nodded. "Just tired." "You thinking about that old man again?" "Yeah." Mrs. Carter leaned against the counter. "You did right by him." "I hope so." "What happened to him wasn't your fault." "I know." But something still felt unfinished. As Tasha stepped outside the store that evening, the air had cleared. The storm clouds were gone. The city lights reflected off clean sidewalks. She walked toward the bus stop out of habit. And that's when she noticed the cars. 3 of them, all black, parked neatly along the curb. They looked expensive, new, and completely out of place on Clayton Street. Men in dark suits stood beside the vehicles. Their posture was straight, alert, the kind of stillness that suggested they weren't waiting for a bus. They were waiting for someone. As Tasha approached, one of the men stepped forward. He was tall, gray hair, sharp eyes behind thin glasses. "Miss Tasha Williams?" he asked. She froze. "Yes?" The man nodded politely. "My name is Richard Cole." His voice carried the calm confidence of someone used to being listened to. "We've been trying to find you." Tasha blinked. "Find me?" He gestured toward the bus stop. May we talk for a moment? Her heart began beating faster. What is this about? Richard Cole looked at her carefully. It's about Harold Bennett. The name hit her chest like a sudden weight. You knew him? The man gave a small nod. Yes. Another suited man opened the door of one of the cars behind him. Tasha hesitated. Her instincts told her to walk away, but curiosity and something deeper kept her standing there. Richard Cole reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a familiar envelope, the same one she had mailed 3 days earlier. Her eyes widened. How did you... We received it this morning. He held it up slightly. Harold left very specific instructions about who should deliver it. Tasha felt the ground shift beneath her feet. What's inside? Richard Cole studied her face. Then he said something that made the entire world suddenly feel very different. You're inside it. Tasha stared at him. I don't understand. He opened the envelope carefully. Inside were several pages of neatly typed documents and one handwritten letter. Richard Cole unfolded the letter. Then he looked at her again. Miss Williams, do you know who Harold Bennett really was? She shook her head slowly. No. The man's expression softened slightly. Harold Bennett wasn't just a homeless man. He paused. He was the founder of one of the largest private aviation companies in the country. The words didn't make sense. They floated in the air between them like a language she couldn't quite translate. That's impossible. Richard Cole shook his head gently. Not impossible. He looked down at the letter again. Just hidden. The wind moved softly through Clayton Street. Cars passed. The city continued its evening rhythm. But for Tasha, the ground beneath everything she thought she knew had suddenly shifted, because the quiet old man she'd shared breakfast with every morning had been hiding a life far bigger than she had ever imagined. And now, that life had just reached out and found her. For several seconds, Tasha couldn't speak. The city noise continued around them, cars rolling through wet streets, a distant siren, footsteps echoing on the sidewalk. But everything sounded muffled, like she was hearing it from underwater. She stared at Richard Cole. The founder of a company? Richard nodded calmly. Yes. That's not possible. I understand why you'd think that. He gestured toward the black sedan. Perhaps it would be easier to explain somewhere more comfortable. Tasha hesitated. Her instinct told her to walk away, but the name Harold Bennett still hung in the air between them, and she needed answers. A moment later, she was sitting in the back seat of the sedan. The interior smelled faintly of leather and new upholstery. Clayton Street slowly disappeared behind them as the car pulled into traffic. Neither of them spoke for a minute. Finally, Tasha asked the question that had been echoing in her mind since the bus stop. If Harold was so important, why was he sleeping on the street? Richard Cole folded his hands neatly in his lap. That's a long story. I've got time. He nodded once. Very well. The car passed beneath a bridge, the sound of tires humming against wet asphalt. 42 years ago, Richard began, Harold Bennett founded Bennett and Cole Aviation with a single helicopter. Tasha blinked. One? Yes. A Bell Huey, actually. Her mind flashed back to the morning Harold had identified the helicopter above Clayton Street, the way he had spoken about it so casually, as if it were just another memory. At the time, Richard continued, medical air transport was still rare in most parts of the country. Harold believed helicopters could save lives if they could reach places ambulances couldn't. So he started a company? From nothing. Richard's voice carried a quiet respect. He flew most of the missions himself in the early years. Tasha leaned forward slightly. That's why he knew so much about helicopters. Yes. The car turned onto a wider avenue now, downtown skyscrapers rising ahead. Over the next 2 decades, Richard continued, the company grew. Emergency transport, disaster response, government contracts, eventually international operations. Tasha tried to picture it. The old man with the worn coat, the cardboard bed beside the bus stop. It doesn't make sense, she said. Richard looked at her. Which part? All of it. He gave a faint smile. Life rarely follows the version people expect. The car slowed at a red light. Outside Tofahu, tall glass buildings reflected the fading evening sky. So what happened to him? Tasha asked. Richard's expression darkened slightly. His wife died. The words hung quietly between them. That must have been hard, Tasha said softly. It was devastating. Richard looked out the window for a moment. They had been married 40 years. What about children? None. The light turned green. The sedan moved forward again. After her death, Richard continued, Harold slowly withdrew from everything. From the company. Yes. He just walked away? In a manner of speaking. Richard sighed. He transferred most operational control to the board and began disappearing for long stretches of time. Disappearing? Traveling. Living quietly. Observing. Observing what? People. Tasha frowned. That sounds strange. Richard nodded slightly. Harold believed wealth changed how the world treated him. Well, it probably did. Yes. He turned toward her. But he wanted to see how the world treated people who had nothing. The realization slowly formed in Tasha's mind. You mean, he chose to live like that? For the past 7 years, yes. Her eyes widened. 7 years. Harold believed kindness revealed the true nature of people. Tasha thought about the businessman who had kicked Harold's blanket, the woman who had pulled her child away, the dozens of strangers who passed by every day without seeing him. And he just watched? Yes. Why? Richard reached into his coat pocket and removed the handwritten letter again. He wrote about that in here. Tasha looked at it carefully. That's the letter he gave me. Yes. He told me to mail it if anything happened to him. And you did exactly what he hoped you would. The car turned onto a quiet downtown street. A tall building rose ahead, glass walls reflecting the lights of the city. Westbridge Tower, the same address written on the envelope. Tasha's heart beat faster. So what does the letter say? She asked. Richard unfolded it. The handwriting was unmistakably Harold's, careful, steady. He began reading aloud. To whoever receives this letter, his voice carried the quiet tone of someone reading something deeply personal. I have spent the last 7 years living among strangers who never knew my name. Tasha felt her chest tighten. I did this for one reason, to understand whether kindness still exists in a world moving too fast to notice suffering. Richard glanced at her briefly before continuing. Most people walked past me. A pause. Some people judged me. Another pause. But one person stopped. Tasha's breath caught. Richard continued reading. Every morning she brought breakfast, not for recognition, not for reward, simply because she believed helping someone mattered. The words blurred slightly as Tasha's eyes filled with tears. Richard lowered the page slightly. You see now why we needed to find you. Tasha whispered. He wrote about me? Richard nodded. Yes. He finished reading the next line. Her name is Tasha Williams. The car came to a stop beneath the towering glass building. Lights glowed from dozens of windows above. Richard folded the letter carefully. Miss Williams, Harold Bennett left very clear instructions about what should happen next. Tasha looked at the building, then back at him. What instructions? Richard opened the car door. Cold evening air rushed inside. You're about to find out. And as Tasha stepped out onto the sidewalk beneath Westbridge Tower, she realized something impossible was happening. The quiet life she had been living, the grocery store shifts, the small apartment, the lonely bus stop mornings, had suddenly collided with a world she had never even imagined. And Harold Bennett, the man everyone thought was just another forgotten stranger, had somehow placed her at the center of it. Tasha stood on the sidewalk staring up at Westbridge Tower. The building rose into the evening sky like a wall of glass and light. Dozens of windows reflected the city below. Moving headlights, glowing street lamps, the quiet rhythm of a downtown that never truly slept. For someone who had spent most of her life walking past buildings like this, the place felt unreal, like stepping into someone else's world. Richard Cole stood beside her calmly. Are you ready? He asked. Tasha shook her head slowly. No. He smiled faintly. That's understandable. The revolving doors turned silently as they entered the lobby. Inside, everything felt polished. The marble floor gleamed beneath soft lighting. Tall plants stood near leather chairs arranged in quiet waiting areas. A security desk sat near the elevators, staffed by 2 guards in crisp uniforms. The moment Richard stepped forward, the guards straightened. Good evening, Mr. Cole. Good evening. The guards glanced briefly at Tasha but said nothing. Richard pressed a keycard against a scanner. The elevator doors opened immediately. Inside, the walls were mirrored. For a moment, Tasha caught her reflection. Her jacket still smelled faintly of rain. Her grocery store uniform showed beneath it. She looked completely out of place. The elevator began rising smoothly. Floor numbers lit one by one. When the doors opened on the 12th floor, a quiet hallway stretched ahead. Soft carpet muted every step. At the far end stood a set of double glass doors. Through them, Tasha could see a large conference room. People were already inside. Several men in suits. 2 women with folders open in front of them. A man standing near the window speaking quietly on his phone. The moment Richard opened the door, the conversation inside stopped. Every pair of eyes turned toward Tasha. She froze. Richard stepped forward confidently. Ladies and gentlemen, he said calmly, this is Tasha Williams. The silence deepened. One of the men, tall, bald, with sharp features, looked confused. This is the woman from the letter? Yes. Another woman flipped through a stack of documents. She's the one Harold wrote about? Richard nodded. Yes. Tasha suddenly felt the weight of the entire room. What's going on? She asked quietly. Richard walked to the head of the long conference table. Please sit. Tasha hesitated before taking the nearest chair. The leather felt strangely soft beneath her. Richard placed Harold's letter in front of him. Harold Bennett passed away 2 days ago, he said. The room remained still. Everyone here already knew, but hearing the words aloud made it real. We are here tonight, Richard continued, to follow his final instructions. The bald man leaned forward. With respect, Richard, the board needs clarification. You'll have it. Richard opened a thick folder. Inside were several legal documents. He slid one across the table toward Tasha. This is Harold Bennett's final directive. She looked down at the pages. The words blurred at first. She wasn't used to legal language, but one line stood out clearly. Bennett and Cole Aviation Holdings. Estimated value, $3.8 billion. Tasha's breath caught. That can't be right. Richard continued calmly. Harold retained majority ownership of the company until the day he died. A woman across the table spoke carefully. And according to his directive? Richard nodded once. He transferred 20% of that ownership. The room fell silent again. The bald man frowned. To whom? Richard turned toward Tasha. To her. The words landed like thunder. Tasha blinked. I think you've made a mistake. No. That kind of money? I've never even… This wasn't a mistake. The woman with the folder spoke again. But she's not family. Richard nodded. That's correct. So why would Harold do this? Richard lifted the letter. He explained it himself. He began reading again. I spent years surrounded by wealth, and I learned something uncomfortable. The room listened. Money attracts many people, but kindness attracts very few. Tasha felt the same tightening in her chest she'd felt earlier. Richard continued. In 7 years living anonymously among strangers, only one person treated me like a human being every single day. The bald man shifted slightly in his chair. Richard read the final line slowly. If kindness still exists in this world, it deserves to be invested in. He lowered the letter. Silence filled the room again. Tasha shook her head slowly. This doesn't feel real. Richard's voice softened. I imagine it doesn't. The bald man rubbed his temples. With respect, this changes the company structure entirely. Yes. And she has no experience in aviation. That's correct. Then why would Harold… Richard cut him off gently. Because Harold didn't measure people by resumes. Tasha looked around the table. Every face here belonged to someone powerful, someone important. People who had likely spent decades building careers in business and aviation. And now they were staring at a grocery store cashier like she had just stepped into the wrong room. She stood slowly. I think I should go. Richard shook his head. Harold asked for one more thing. She paused. What? He folded the letter carefully. Before he died, Harold recorded a video message. The room stirred. A video? Someone asked. Yes. Richard pressed a button on a remote. The large screen on the wall flickered to life. For a moment it remained black. Then the image appeared. Tasha gasped softly. There he was. Harold Bennett. Not sitting on cardboard beside the bus stop, but seated comfortably in a quiet office, wearing a clean jacket, his hair neatly combed, looking older, but unmistakably the same man. He looked directly into the camera and smiled. Well, if you're watching this, I suppose my little experiment has finally come to an end. The room leaned forward, but Tasha couldn't move because the man on the screen, the man everyone had ignored on Clayton Street, was now about to tell the entire room why he had chosen her. The screen flickered softly as Harold Bennett leaned forward in his chair. The room on the 12th floor fell completely silent. Even the quiet hum of the air conditioning seemed to fade as everyone focused on the image before them. Harold looked older than Tasha remembered. His face was thinner, but his eyes held the same calm warmth she had seen every morning at the bus stop. He adjusted slightly in his seat and gave a small, thoughtful smile. Well, he began, his voice steady, if you're watching this, then I suppose my little experiment has finally reached its conclusion. A few people in the room shifted uneasily, but Harold continued. For those of you sitting in that conference room, you probably expected a traditional farewell, something about business strategy or leadership. He shook his head gently. But that's not what this is. Tasha couldn't take her eyes off the screen. It felt surreal seeing Harold like this, clean, composed, sitting in an office instead of beside a bus stop bench. Harold folded his hands together. For 7 years, I stepped away from this company, not because I lost faith in it, but because I needed to answer a question. He paused. A simple one. His eyes seemed to look directly into the camera. Does kindness still exist when there's nothing to gain from it? The room remained silent. Harold leaned back slightly. When you have wealth, people treat you very differently. Doors open, strangers smile. Everyone wants to be helpful. A faint shadow crossed his face, but I began to wonder if that kindness was real, or simply attracted by money. The screen shifted slightly as the camera adjusted focus, so I removed the one thing that had always followed me. He smiled softly. My name. A few quiet murmurs moved through the conference room. Harold continued. I left the suits behind, the offices, the reputation. His voice remained calm. And I became someone the world usually ignores. Tasha felt a tightness in her chest, because she remembered those mornings. People walking past Harold like he didn't exist. Cars splashing rainwater onto the sidewalk beside him, the businessman kicking his blanket. Harold's voice returned gently. For the first few months, I thought perhaps I had been wrong. A pause. No one stopped. Another pause. Hundreds of people passed me every day. His eyes lowered briefly. Some looked uncomfortable. Some looked annoyed. Most simply looked away. Tasha's hands tightened around the edge of the table. Harold looked back at the camera. But then one morning, something unexpected happened. The room grew even quieter. A small smile appeared on his face. A young woman sat down beside me and handed me a sandwich. Tasha felt the entire room glance in her direction. Harold continued speaking. She didn't ask questions. She didn't judge. She didn't expect anything in return. His voice softened. She simply believed helping someone mattered. The screen remained steady. Then she came back the next day. A few board members shifted in their seats. And the day after that. Harold's smile grew warmer. And the day after that. Tasha's eyes filled with tears she hadn't expected. For months, Harold continued, this young woman brought breakfast to a man she believed was just another homeless stranger. He leaned forward slightly. She had no idea who I was. Another pause. And that's exactly why it mattered. Harold took a slow breath. In those small moments each morning, she showed me something this world desperately needs to remember. The room remained completely still. That kindness is not dead. His voice grew slightly firmer. It's just rare. Harold looked directly at the camera again. And when you find something rare, he smiled, you protect it. Richard Cole stood quietly beside the screen, his arms folded as he listened. Harold continued. Tasha Williams reminded me of something I had almost forgotten. His eyes softened again. That compassion doesn't require wealth. He gestured gently with one hand. Or power. Another pause. It simply requires a good heart. The room remained silent. Harold leaned back slightly in his chair. So when the time came for me to decide what should happen next, his smile returned. The choice became very clear. Tasha shook her head slightly, whispering under her breath. No, Harold finished the sentence calmly. Invest in kindness. The screen flickered briefly as the video continued. To the board members watching this, I understand that my decision may surprise you. A few people around the table exchanged glances. But leadership isn't always about experience. Harold's voice remained steady. Sometimes it's about character. He looked straight at the camera again. Tasha. Her heart skipped. If you're sitting in that room right now, you're probably wondering why someone like me would trust someone like you. Her breath caught. His voice softened again. Because you saw a human being where everyone else saw a problem. He smiled gently. And that tells me everything I need to know. The room felt heavier with every word. Harold's expression became thoughtful. I don't expect you to run this company alone. He glanced slightly off camera, as if acknowledging someone nearby. Richard will help guide you. Richard nodded quietly. But I do expect you to protect the thing that started it all. The screen shifted again. Saving lives. Harold looked back toward the camera. Helicopters reach places ambulances can't. His eyes brightened slightly. And sometimes, kindness reaches places money never could. A quiet breath escaped Tasha. Harold leaned closer to the camera for the final time. So, if you're wondering whether you belong in that room, he smiled warmly. You already proved that you do. The screen slowly faded to black. The conference room remained completely silent. No one moved. No one spoke. Because the quiet old man everyone had ignored on Clayton Street had just changed the future of an entire company and the life of the young woman sitting at the end of the table. For several seconds after the screen went dark, no one in the conference room moved. The silence felt thick, like the air itself needed time to process what had just happened. Tasha sat frozen in her chair. Her mind struggled to catch up with the last few minutes. Harold's voice still echoed in her ears. Invest in kindness. Across the table, the board members exchanged uncertain glances. Some looked skeptical. Others looked thoughtful. But everyone understood the same thing now. Harold Bennett had made his decision long before this meeting began. The bald man cleared his throat. Well, he said carefully, that certainly explains his reasoning. A woman beside him closed her folder slowly. I never imagined Harold would do something like this. Another man leaned back in his chair. Neither did the market analysts. Richard Cole stepped forward calmly. Harold spent 7 years thinking about this decision. He looked around the table. He was rarely impulsive. The bald man sighed. Yes, but placing 20% of the company in the hands of someone with no business background. He glanced toward Tasha. That's unprecedented. Tasha felt every eye in the room shift toward her again. Her chest tightened. I don't want to cause problems, she said quietly. Richard shook his head. You're not. But this isn't my world. You'd be surprised how quickly the world can change. She looked down at the documents in front of her. The numbers still felt unreal. Billions of dollars. Company ownership. Corporate leadership. Just 3 days ago, she had been worrying about the electric bill taped to her refrigerator. Now she was sitting in a boardroom overlooking the entire city. I'm not the person Harold thinks I am, she whispered. Richard studied her carefully. From what I've seen, you are. The bald man leaned forward again. Let's be realistic here. His voice wasn't cruel, but it was firm. This company operates in 22 states and 5 countries. It runs medical rescue flights, disaster response units, and government contracts. He gestured toward the windows. This is not a charity project. Richard nodded calmly. No one suggested it was. The man crossed his arms. Then we need to discuss practical leadership. Another board member spoke quietly. Harold never intended for her to run daily operations. Richard lifted a page from the folder. That's correct. He slid the document toward the center of the table. This outlines the structure Harold designed. The woman with the folder leaned forward to read it. So she becomes a major shareholder? Yes. And a voting member of the board? Correct. The bald man frowned slightly. That still gives her influence over company direction. Richard nodded. That was Harold's intention. The room fell quiet again. Finally, the woman beside him spoke. Well, she looked toward Tasha. Miss Williams, may I ask something? Tasha nodded slowly. Of course. Why did you help him? The question caught her off guard. don't know. You must have had a reason. She thought for a moment, then answered honestly. He looked lonely. Several people exchanged glances. That's it? The woman asked. Yes. The bald man leaned back again. You didn't suspect anything? No. You never thought he might be someone important? Tasha shook her head. I thought he was just an old man who needed breakfast. The room fell quiet again. Richard spoke softly. That's exactly the point Harold was making. The woman closed her folder gently. Kindness without expectation. Richard nodded. Exactly. The city lights outside the windows flickered as traffic moved through the streets below. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Richard turned back to Tasha. There's one more thing Harold left for you. She looked up. What is it? He reached into the folder again. This time he removed a smaller envelope, cream-colored, thicker than the first one. He asked that this be given to you after the video. Tasha hesitated before taking it. Her fingers trembled slightly. Inside was a folded letter. She opened it slowly. The handwriting was unmistakable. Harold's. She read it silently at first. Then Richard gently asked, Would you like to read it aloud? She swallowed and nodded. Her voice was soft. Tasha. The room listened. If you're reading this, then my time has finally come to an end. Her eyes blurred slightly, but she continued. I want you to know something important. A breath. You didn't just give an old man breakfast. She paused. You reminded him why he built helicopters in the first place. Her voice trembled slightly now. So people who needed help could be reached. The board members listened quietly. Every morning you proved that compassion still exists in this world. She blinked back tears. And that means there's still hope for it. She read the final lines slowly. So if this responsibility feels too large, a small smile appeared on her face as she finished. Just remember what you did at that bus stop. She lowered the letter. The room remained silent, but the atmosphere had changed. Something softer now filled the space. The bald man sighed quietly. Well, he said, I suppose Harold always did have unusual instincts. The woman beside him nodded slowly. And they were usually right. Richard looked at Tasha. What would you like to do? She stared at the letter in her hands. The memory of those early mornings returned vividly. The cold air, the quiet conversations, the simple routine that had once seemed so ordinary. Finally, she looked up. I want to help people. The room waited. How? The bald man asked. She looked toward the city outside the window. Just like Harold did. Richard smiled faintly. I believe he would like that. And in that quiet room on the 12th floor, the small act of kindness that had started at a lonely bus stop on Clayton Street was about to grow into something far bigger than anyone in the room had expected. For a long moment, the conference room remained quiet. The city lights outside shimmered across the tall windows, reflecting softly against the glass table. Tasha still held Harold's letter in her hands. It felt heavier now, not because of the paper, but because of what it meant. Richard Cole spoke gently. Harold didn't choose you because he thought you were perfect. Tasha looked up. He chose you because you cared. She took a slow breath. I'm still the same person I was yesterday. That's exactly why this works. Across the table, the bald board member rubbed his chin thoughtfully. You said you want to help people. Tasha nodded. Yes. He leaned forward slightly. Then you should know something about this company. Richard smiled faintly. He's right. The woman with the folder slid a document across the table. Bennett and Cole runs the largest private medical helicopter network in the country. She turned a page. Last year alone, our crews performed over 30,000 emergency flights. Tasha blinked. That many? Yes. The woman's voice softened. People trapped in floods, patients in rural hospitals, search and rescue operations. She looked directly at Tasha. This company already saves lives every day. Tasha glanced toward the window. Helicopter lights blinked faintly in the distance above the city skyline. Harold's words echoed in her memory. Helicopters reach places ambulances can't. Richard stepped beside her. Harold built this company because he believed help should reach people wherever they are. He nodded toward the documents. You can continue that. Tasha looked around the table. For the first time, the faces in the room seemed less intimidating, less distant, more human. What would Harold do first? She asked. Richard didn't hesitate. He would expand the mission. How? By reaching the people who fall through the cracks. The bald man leaned forward again. You mean communities that can't afford medical flights? Richard nodded. Exactly. Tasha's mind began connecting the pieces. The people Harold lived beside. Yes. The woman across the table added quietly. Rural towns, isolated neighborhoods, places hospitals struggle to reach quickly. Tasha thought about Clayton Street, about the people who walked past the bus stop every day, some rushing to work, some struggling just to survive. What if we started a foundation? She said slowly. The board members exchanged curious looks. Richard raised an eyebrow. Tell us more. Tasha's voice grew steadier. A program that funds emergency flights for people who can't afford them. The bald man considered the idea. That would be expensive. Yes. But it would save lives. The woman beside him nodded thoughtfully. That aligns with Harold's philosophy. Richard smiled. It does. The man leaned back in his chair. Well, if Harold trusted her instincts, he glanced toward the others. Perhaps we should listen. A few quiet nods followed around the table. Richard turned toward Tasha again. It seems your first decision as a board member is already taking shape. Tasha looked down at Harold's letter again. The words at the end stayed with her. Just remember what you did at that bus stop. Helping someone didn't require power or wealth, just the decision to stop walking past. She looked back at Richard. When do we start? He smiled. Tonight, if you'd like. The board members chuckled softly, but something hopeful had entered the room. Outside, the distant thrum of helicopter blades echoed faintly across the city. Tasha turned toward the sound. The aircraft moved across the sky like a small point of light. Somewhere out there, someone might need help, and somewhere else, someone might be waiting, just like Harold had once waited at that bus stop. Richard followed her gaze. You know, he said quietly, Harold used to say something. What? He believed the smallest acts of kindness can travel further than any helicopter. Tasha smiled gently. That sounds like him. The meeting slowly began to end. Papers were gathered. Chairs moved softly across the carpet. But before leaving the room, Tasha walked to the tall window overlooking the city. Far below, traffic flowed through glowing streets, and in the distance, Clayton Street. She could almost picture the bus stop from here. The bench, the brick wall, the quiet place where a forgotten old man had once sat. A place where a simple breakfast had started a chain of events no one could have predicted. Richard stepped beside her. You all right? She nodded. Yes. What are you thinking about? She smiled softly. That bus stop. Richard chuckled. I had a feeling. Tasha looked out over the city again. I think Harold knew something most people forget. What's that? That kindness isn't small. She glanced at the lights stretching across the skyline. It just starts small. The helicopter in the distance turned and disappeared into the night sky. Somewhere, someone was being rescued. Somewhere, someone's life was about to change. And on Clayton Street, beneath a quiet bus shelter where an old man once slept, a small act of compassion had grown into something powerful enough to touch thousands of lives. Because sometimes, the people the world overlooks the most are the ones who end up changing it. And sometimes, all it takes is one small act of kindness. One sandwich, one moment, one person who decides not to walk away. If Harold's story moved you, I want to ask you something simple. Type 1 in the comments if you believe kindness still exists in this world. Or type 0 if you think the world has forgotten it. There's no right or wrong answer. I just want to hear from you. And if this story touched your heart, make sure you subscribe to the channel, because the next story we share might surprise you, inspire you, or even change the way you see the world. Thank you for being here. And remember, sometimes the smallest kindness can travel farther than we ever imagine.